Hello and welcome to the Deep Dive Perspective. Chemical weapons, propaganda, regime change. These are just some of the issues that we're going to unearth in our conversation today with Dr. Piers Robinson. Welcome to the show, Piers.
It's very good to be with you.
And I found your study, of course, on the OPCW, the whole Chemical Weapons Agency. They're meant to monitor that area of biochemical weaponry and other dangerous gases, etc. Things we thought that were never going to return after the First World War, things that shouldn't be in play. Yet we saw sarin gas. We've seen the Halabja killings by Saddam Hussein, the sarin related to ISIS forces, which are allegedly backed up by MI6 and the Western deep state. We've seen, of course, the allegations thrown at Assad at that time around chemical weapons and the way they were manipulated, arguably, to create propaganda and a sort of mood music for the regime change of Assad. What's going on within the world of institutions that are meant to be watchdogs, but actually seem often to become a little compromised? And I'll throw in the likes of the WHO. I'll throw in, for instance, the AIEA, the Atomic Agency itself, and perhaps even the UN. There seem to have been so many failures of international institutions that it begs the question, are people safe? Is the world safe in the hands of such agencies? And if not, why not? That's one of the kind of major issues that's on my mind. But let's focus on it as an example today of the OPCW in the light of propaganda that is used by deep state and by states themselves openly. What's your overview, first of all, around this issue?
Well, the overview on the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which was established during the 1990s in order to essentially implement the Chemical Weapons Convention, is a gold standard organization, UN-linked, and it is there to attempt to rid the world of chemical weapons. And in some ways, it was very successful at that for a significant period of time. But in the war in Syria, which, as we know now, was a regime change conflict in Syria. It was not a civil war. You had a major CIA-Saudi joint Operation Timber Sycamore, funding extremists in order to try to overthrow the Syrian government. During that war, allegations of chemical weapons use started to be leveled at the Syrian government from very early on in the conflict, from 2012. And then, of course, in 2013, there was the infamous Ghouta sarin event attack, which, of course, the US and the British government blamed on the Syrian government. And it was, they were trying to use it in order to justify a massive intervention in Syria. Now, that then led to the Syrian government acceding to the Chemical Weapons Convention and abandoning its strategic arsenal of chemical weapons. The allegation that it was responsible for Ghouta 2013 does not stand up to scrutiny, and I've written about this in articles. People can find them online, and many other people have researched that. This was almost definitely a false flag attack, which was carried out in 2013. It was designed to frame the Syrian government, to push the Americans into a full-blown military intervention in the country. So a classic false flag event. But Syria, they managed to diffuse the international crisis by acceding to the Chemical Weapons Convention. And then the allegations started to surface again that chlorine gas cylinders were being dropped from Syrian government helicopters, and that these were occasionally killing people or causing people various injuries. And this is when the OPCW really started to become involved in examining these allegations through its fact-finding mission. And this has been going on. This went on for many, many years, with these allegations being made, fact-finding missions being deployed to Syria, and then over time, sort of these reports coming out, which were very mildly suggesting, well, that there is some evidence possibly that the Syrian government was responsible. And many people were questioning this and saying, well, these scientific reports don't really stack up. They don't quite make sense. And we don't have time to go into the details of that. But the key thing here is that come 2018, there was another alleged, this time an alleged sarin attack initially in the town of Douma, in the outskirts of Damascus. And that's when I started to become much more involved in researching the chemical weapons issue. That is when two scientists within the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons essentially protested initially internally and then externally that their investigation of what happened in Douma had been manipulated by people higher up in the OPCW, and it had been manipulated in order to point the finger at the Syrian government. And this led to leaked documents going to WikiLeaks, for example. It led to an OPCW official giving testimony at a panel in Brussels in 2019. And it has led since then. I work alongside Hans von Sponeck. He's a former Assistant Secretary General to the UN. And Jose Bustani, who's the first Director General of the OPCW. We work as part of a group representing these scientists. And we've been doing that for many years. But essentially, the wheels came off the chemical weapons narrative at that point when these OPCW scientists essentially revealed to the world, not that the mainstream media paid any attention, but they revealed for people who took the time to look, that in fact, the OPCW investigations of these alleged attacks were being corrupted. Now, I've looked at this many more cases now and writing a book on the topic. And, you time and time again, you find these alleged chemical attacks in Syria investigated by the OPCW actually end up looking like false flags, evidence-wise. And of course, most of the information supplied for these alleged attacks were coming from the famous White Helmets, who were a UK government-linked agency on the ground in Syria.
Yes.
And, they were supplying the information to the OPCW. And so you have, in a sense, OPCW investigations remarkably relying upon information coming from one side in a conflict. So you can see how the kind of manipulation and the distortion of these investigations started to, really work into the reports and then lead to these kind of suggestions that, well, maybe the Syrian government is using these chemical weapons. And this is what we've got, and this is not just to do with what happened in Douma. It's to do with the other alleged chemical weapons attacks and what we now know about the manipulation and the corruption of those investigations. And of course, and just to finish on the main point here, what this all means, as you said in your introduction, is that these international organizations, which are really there, they're supposed to be there, linked to the UN as part of helping to maintain international peace and security, getting rid of chemical weapons, identifying perpetrators of chemical weapons attacks. But what's happened in the case of the OPCW in Syria is effectively it's been co-opted or it's been penetrated by intelligence agencies from the West, and I won't go into the details on that. And it's become a tool of propaganda. It's been a way of helping to rubber stamp the allegations against the Syrian government on the chemical weapons issue again and again and again, and essentially underpin the regime change war that went on in Syria, which of course now is successful. 2024 saw the overthrow of the Syrian government, the replacement by an extremist group backed by us in power, and the conflict carries on, as I'm sure you're aware, and many of your guests will be aware of this. And Vanessa Beeley, I think, has spoken about this on your show.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
So this is the problem. These organizations, and this is why it's such a big and such an important issue, the OPCW, is that people accept at face value what these organizations say because they think that they're independent. And it's very, very clear that in the case of Syrian chemical weapons, it is not acted independently and it's not acted objectively. And this, of course, is why Jose Bustani works with myself and Hans von Sponeck. Jose Bustani, of course, as I said before, was the first Director General of the OPCW. He was kicked out by Bolton in a run-up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq because he was not willing to allow his organization basically to play ball with the American regime change objectives. Remember weapons of mass destruction?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, Jose Bustani was able to resist, or he resisted that pressure from the US authorities. And what happened? They kicked him out of the OPCW. They managed to get him forced out of the organization. So at that point, you have the start of, I think, the kind of the institutional corruption of the OPCW. And it took a long time, but eventually with Syria, you finally had two scientists who were brave enough, and they lost a lot in the process of standing up and speaking out. To actually, but it took that long for people within the organization to say something about what was going on. And that's essentially where we are with that issue. But that's what it does tell us in terms of the bigger picture, is that these organizations and the OPCW is manipulated in the case of Syria. But of course, as we were talking before we started, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and if you remember in the summer before the 12-day war against Iran, it was all to do with the nuclear, the IAEA reports. And you had the same dynamic there, where you had the IAEA playing into the propaganda narrative being promoted by Israel and the US in order to justify the 12-day war that we had there. So this is, in a way, as big as you can get in terms of international politics. You know, international politics, UN is there about maintaining peace and security. That's why the thing was invented, okay? And if its key institutions and organizations linked to it have been co-opted, they're actually, their role has been, perverted, as it were, in the international system. These have become tools for war making and war propaganda, which is why this is so important, because we're still in this. We're still in this with the OPCW, and we're still in it with the IAEA, and we're still in, as we know full well, in a potential situation of a war against Iran.
Yes,
they're bringing in the rioters, and we want to bring democracy and save these people, but they'll flip again to the nuclear justification, and they'll probably pull the IAEA in again in order to try and build that propaganda. So this is about the biggest matters of war and peace in the international system, which is why people should care about the OPCW and care about the scientists who've spoken out, and pay attention to it.
Well, I think you've given us a fantastic overview. We really needed that kind of summary to connect it up, because often that's what the problem is. People don't have the information, they trust too much, and they also actually don't know what the dynamics are of the relationship between such organizations and state players, but also transnational corporations, because there's big business in nuclear energy, there's big business in all of these kinds of fields that these agencies use. The WHO I could quote as well. There's massive money around big pharma, etc. So it is a very, very big issue. But I wanted to use the OPCW and the chemical weapons, the sarin gas allegations, etc., as a real alarm bell, because there's a proven case here. I mean, I will go on to the IAEA later, because I've done my own homework on that as well. But in terms of the OPCW, I mean, the accountability is the issue, isn't it? And who votes these people in? Who are the people who get the president or whatever, or the hierarchy within its institutions voted in? How does that work? How do these international agencies appoint whoever's in charge?
Yeah, I mean, organizations such as the OPCW, these are international organizations that they are formed through agreements between nation states. And then they have procedures, they have an executive council, they have the States Party Conference, which represents all the members who vote. And, historically, this organization was meant to be established and to be a rigorous scientific organization whose procedures and protocols were essentially strictly geared towards allowing the OPCW to objectively assess, chemical weapons capability of states in order to make sure that the Chemical Weapons Convention was being enforced. And that's how the organization was structurally set up. And as I said at the start, in a sense, it worked well for a while. And under Jose Bustani's leadership, it was tremendously successful at getting a very large number of states in the international system to sign up to the Chemical Weapons Convention and start to get rid of these weapons. what has happened, and what happened from certainly after Bustani was pushed out, but what happened with, for example, Syria, is that the pressure exerted by specifically France, United Kingdom, and the United States on that organization in order to essentially start to set up ad hoc investigation missions, which the fact-finding missions were. They weren't even operating within the Chemical Weapons Convention. And what happens is that the US, powerful country, is able to push and cajole other member states to vote in, and override opposition from other states. So these entities become created, and then essentially with the FFMs in Syria, and again, I'm not at liberty at the moment to dispose or to say what I know on the details of this, but people who are intelligence agency linked from the West getting into those operations.
Right.
So you have this kind of pressure being exerted, control over the organization or influence over the organization. And in a sense, this is the classic problem with international organizations and big, powerful states, is that big, powerful states are able to exert significant influence. And as you said before, it happens with the World Health Organization. Arguably, it happens with the UN in general. That, the UN does not act as a neutral, independent, objective entity. Is heavily influenced by the most powerful states. Now, of course, during the Cold War, you had the sort of standoff Russia-China versus the US at the UN Security Council level. In the organizations such as the OPCW, and of course the Russians have been forced out at the moment from the OPCW Executive Council, you have essentially classic, international politics playing out. You have countries being bribed, cajoled, pressured, etc., to come on board with the narrative. And I think, and that's what any realist theorists have always said this about international organizations, is that they're not really independent. They're not independent of the powerful players in the international system. And so that's the problem, that these organizations ultimately, and the OPCW has not been robust enough as an organization to withstand those pressures.
Interesting. Now, remind me of the OPCW's role over the Iraq scenario, because it was very famous. Those Kurdish villages that were gassed. Was that under Mr. Bustami's time, and how did they react to that in comparison
to the Chemical Weapons Convention? What happened in Iraq in the late 1980s, that was prior to the creation of the Chemical Weapons Convention. In fact, in some ways, the Chemical Weapons Convention, the impetus to create it came from events such as Halabja, and also those kind of atrocities that were committed during the Iran-Iraq war. So the OPCW was, I think it's 1996, the organization formed, and this is when the Chemical Weapons Convention was created. So this is, after those events.
Right. That's shocking, because you'd have thought First World War, chemical weapons were used extensively, and lots of young men across Europe and beyond were killed by various gases. Mustard gas was the most famous one that I can remember. But did they not have things in place, post First, Second World War?
No. Chemical, biological, nuclear, and nuclear non-proliferation treaties, all of the legislation or all of the treaties in relation to that are on very thin ice today, given America's withdrawal. Biological weapons, chemical weapons, these have all been treaties which took a long time to start to try to create and make the case for, and as with the OPCW, it wasn't until the 90s, it wasn't until the post-Cold War phase. So I think with the United Nations, in terms of after the Second World War, the major imperative was just maintain international peace and security, prevent great power conflict. And of course, the other one was prevent genocide, never again. But look what happened with that. Again, that points to the weakness of these organizations ultimately. Now, I'm not a complete pessimist when it comes to these kind of organizations, in the sense that, that they're good for nothing and they should be just closed down. I suppose I still have some kind of liberal side to me which believes that maybe we can create a more peaceful, more just world through such organizations. But at this point in time, the UN's looking to me to be a very weakened organization. Its ability to deal with the genocide against the Palestinians is clear. its ability to stop the regime change war against Syria was obvious. I mean, the UN and the International Commission investigating Syria was never even able to grasp the basic point that this was a war that was being supported. The overthrow of the government was a regime change war being conducted by the US, French, all the Gulf states, and Israel as well were in on the regime change operation. The UN is almost oblivious to that. It's extraordinary. So, the organization, League of Nations, in the run up to the Second World War, of course, and it failed at that point. These organizations, have become corrupted. I mean,
the thing that jumps at me is, you talked about biosecurity, which is a term that rarely anybody even thinks about. But of course, the COVID scenario, this sarin gas, people won't necessarily link them either, and even the atomic weapons issue. But to me, the alarm bell is this, and this is shocking. What you're talking about is if we don't have trust in oversight bodies which can keep an eye on countries and nations and have access properly and be neutral in the way they deal with things, then that means the whole planet is under threat. Because when we talk about biosecurity, we can talk about water supplies, air. We can talk about the release of such chemicals which could be put through water supplies, put through the air or whatever, which would then affect the whole of humanity. It's really not a joke. And for us to have the level of kind of incompetence or compromising that's going on, is that, you'd have thought that the Security Council, say the Chinese and the Russians and whatnot, would have made this a massive issue. Have they?
Well, I'm not sure. I'd have to go and look at sort of how much cognizance there is of this wider issue that you point to. But certainly on the OPCW and Syria issue, is China and Russia and Iran and other countries have been flagging this up, the problem. Yeah. And they've even been talking about the whistleblowers as well, even at UN Security Council level. Problem is that the Americans and the Brits just dismiss it out of hand and don't respond. So they have been engaging on that level. The kind of issue you flagged up there is this broader biosecurity complex that we have today, this kind of manufacturing of threats and threat perception based around fear of biological viruses, man-made, natural. This is a huge industry, and I think this came through with COVID-19, is that these actors, and the World Health Organization was clearly, obviously, caught up in that, was, in a sense, creating this wide, broad-scale propaganda narrative based on the terrifying people about COVID-19 in order to justify a whole raft of vaccine and various things being pushed upon populations, but also interventions, lockdowns. This was an architecture which was was about controlling populations, much more about controlling populations than it was to do with dealing with any kind of health threat or crisis which they were claiming was occurring. I don't think the science bears that out now, that there was anything of the form that was being described at the time. So, and again, this is getting into this kind of much wider, slightly more abstract territory, but you have these agendas, you have these powerful interests, these big industry players who are pushing this. There's a political interest in terms of how these fears can be used to control populations, COVID-19, lockdowns, disciplining populations. And then there's huge money to be made as well through this security industry. You see this after 9/11, and my work on 9/11. This was a false flag event which initiated the entire global war on terror and regime change. But you see with 9/11, that was also used to introduce the Patriot Act, and it was about getting control over populations. And so these are the kind of broad dynamics that you see with these big organizations. They become co-opted and they become a part of, essentially, promoting narrative, broad meta-narratives, which just exploited again and again in order to control populations and manipulate people. COVID-19 was on a surprisingly global scale. We're back at the moment with things such as Iran, nuclear, back to the more familiar territory of war, of propaganda for war. This is the learning. This is the kind of the learning process which people need to go through, or populations certainly in the West.
Well, I'm interested in this. I'm interested in the word propaganda because, in and of itself, the fact that these kinds of chemical weapons or chemical gases, etc., are not monitored or reported on in a way which is independent and are influenced by the powers that be, certainly within the Western hierarchy, it seems they seem to have greater influence over all this. That's concerning enough as it is. But for it to be then weaponized as part of a propaganda tool by those same powers in order to create regime change, to engineer politics around the world, to create fear amongst people, that strikes me a little. I mean, I've followed, for instance, the World Economic Forum quite a bit in terms of what they do and what Klaus Schwab's agenda was. Very closely ties into the United Nations, again, this kind of rather weak, defunct-looking organization increasingly, and this WEF, which is a nothing organization which seems to wield an awful lot of power and is also shaping visions of the future which the United Nations have bought into with Agenda 2030 and the sustainable, policies and strategies that they've been trying to roll out. I can't help but make that connection that there's this notion of taking the world to a certain place. And time when I hear Yuval Harari, some of the philosophers of the WEF, and then the state, the United Nations itself, and the reports they go after and what they produce, it does seem as though that depopulation is rather dangerously transparent within a lot of what they do, whilst it's not clearly in the paperwork. But everything that they seem to say and do, ultimately for me, indicates a need to reduce the population. And they've not made that a secret either. The WEF is very clear about it. They want to depopulate. Bill Gates, who funds the WHO to a huge extent, with the Gates Foundation, is very much committed to depopulation and using vaccines. He's on record in saying that he wants to use vaccinations to help depopulate. What that means, I'm not sure. I thought vaccinations were meant to save people. Really weird, some of the statements he's made, but very, very dangerous. There is a school of eugenicists. There is a school of Malthusian ideologues, of which Bill Gates and several of these others I could name as being, loosely connected to, if not overtly. That in itself becomes so worrying, because if these people are the ones who are beginning to dominate and control these organizations, like the OPCW or the nuclear IAEA outfits, these are all agencies that deal with things which are capable of mass destruction. Mass planetary level destruction. And so who's watching the watchers is the question, because if these watchdogs have been compromised, and clearly if the president of the OPCW has whistleblown and is saying so, and there's lots of other evidence, then where does our investigation stop, and how do we have some kind of control over even these watchdogs?
Well, yeah, I mean, the scenario that you describe, I think is this is where we are at. International organizations are there to do one thing. They have been corrupted. Ultimately, power and money talk. They have the loudest voices. And that they have, essentially, they're running these organizations in a way that they do become a threat to humanity, as you described. I think the bottom line with the COVID-19 event, and I to take Peter Dale Scott's line on this, or I describe it as a structural deep event. This was an instigated event in order to do a lot of work in terms of restructuring the economy and politics and so on. You have these. This event was there to. So I lost my train of thought on that. Yeah.
Well, an extension to this, Piers, is the more contemporary, and you've raised it a few times, and I've not gone deeper. I will now. The Islamic Republic of Iran is currently under huge pressure and is being regime changed. Essentially, we've seen that rolled out steadily over years. Color revolutions and psychological operations, terrorist operations, all sorts has gone on. This gassing of the Iranian troops back in the first Gulf War, as I describe it, when Iraq was backed by pretty much most of the world's major powers to unleash an attack on the newly formed Islamic Republic based on the Islamic Revolution. And they actually, in order to push back, in order to stop Iran's victory in that battle, which Saddam had started, invading Iran, of course, they used gas, they used these chemical weapons. And now we find a scenario where they're moaning and groaning about Islamic Republic of Iran having the capability of making nuclear weapons, yet that same IAEA does nothing in terms of Israel or the scrutiny of Israel. And that to me tells me, again, you've outlined the OPCW, but I could now go into the IAEA.
I agree, Matt. I just remember exactly where I was going. With COVID, the policies pursued under COVID were not in the interests of the global population. Just the collateral damage alone caused huge damage, huge loss of life. And so, that's the ugly reality that we're confronted with, is that because these organizations are co-opted by powerful actors and groups who do not have our interests at heart, they are a threat to us. They have become a threat to us. And in the same way you just described in relation to Iran. And that's the big problem we have. How we push back against that, I mean, all it takes people to be aware of these things and to demand change. We have people demanding change on a variety of areas. There's a lot of pushback on COVID-19. There's a lot of pushback on the war. Is it enough? I don't know. A lot of the population remain asleep. The mainstream media don't do the job that they're supposed to be doing. We could barely get any of the mainstream media to look into the OPCW issue other than Peter Hitchens. He did cover the story for a while. We're up against, it's a very big fight, and how we correct it is not clear. But in the first instance, people waking up to the role these organizations are playing, and that this, of course, people have this very sort of rose-tinted view of the UN and even of the World Health Organization prior to COVID. People think, this would be a wonderful organization to work for. This is doing good in the world. And then you start to see what they're actually doing, and with COVID-19 and how much harm was done to the global population. Arguably on the same level as the wars. I mean, we've been talking about Iran, we've been talking about Syria, the regime change wars after 9/11, huge loss of life. But if you actually add those numbers up and you put them next to, for example, the collateral damage from the COVID-19 response, you've got a pretty sort of tight race there in terms of which is causing more damage to people. But still, both are causing harm. That they're there as they're threatening humanity essentially, and so we've got our work cut out for ourselves.
One thing comes to mind in terms of solutions. You'd have thought that if these organizations are now increasingly dominated by Western powers, if you like, the interests of America and its partners, then surely there's scope for beginning to say, well, we need parallel organizations. If these organizations can't be reformed or can't be made accountable, would BRICS and the Eurasian axis, I mean, there's some powerful players there, would there be a case to argue that they should be spearheading these kinds of new institutions? And are they trustworthy enough to do it?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, Hans von Sponik, the man I mentioned I work with on the OPCW issue, he and Professor Richard Falk, have just got a book out last year on reforming the United Nations. And of course, they're both, both former UN people. Hans resigned over the sanctions policy against Iraq in the 1990s. They believe it can be reformed. And they put their proposals describing how it should be reformed. And I don't know, maybe it can be reformed, or maybe, as you just described, maybe we need to see the emergence of, and I don't know whether BRICS is the right contender here, but the emergence of some kind of bloc which pushes back against what we've been living through for 100 plus years in terms of Western imperialism. to cut a long story short, do you have blocs emerging to push back against that, and then forming, as you just said, parallel organizations, or just simply supplanting organizations which are clearly moribund? And it could go either way. I suspect at the moment we could see a real genuine push to reform the UN and all of the organizations connected to it, or it might die a death. It's impossible. I don't know. I don't know what way it will go at the moment. But we'll have to see. Well, I don't know, with the World Health Organization, at least there's a lot of awareness, or at least a lot of people know about the World Health Organization and the problematic role it plays compared to, say, before COVID-19. So more people have woken up. More people have woken up to Western imperialism and can see, as you just pointed out, where is the UN on the genocide against the Palestinians? It's remarkable that they can't, they have this kind of blinkered view. And I know that the UN has been speaking in some ways, but it's still very, very limited, very, very late in the day.
Well, nothing's really been done in terms of Russia. When it invaded Ukraine, they sanctioned Russia straight away. They can sanction Iran for doing virtually nothing. But why was no sanction on Israel? But I don't understand it to this day.
Yes, it's a double standard. So, we'll have to see which way it goes. I mean, in a sense, as I said before, the most important, from my point of view, a step at the moment is for enough people to realize what's going on with these organizations, and then people can start to think through what options should be pursued: reform or replacement. The reality of international politics and war and conflict may mean that that, as it were, realpolitik ultimately takes us through to whatever the next era is. Are we going to have a global war? I mean, we're not a million miles away from this at the moment, considering the rhetoric we're seeing between Russia, America, Iran, Israel. It is not impossible to conceive of a major global conflict. I would say that probably, if you were to look at all the multiple conflicts going on at the moment, we're probably in the foothills of a global conflict. And historians will probably look back at this phase and say, well, actually, this was a world war of a particular intensity. The question at the moment, is it going to get even worse? So we're going to have to see how all of that plays out, and how institutions such as UN navigate through that, and how they come out the other end.
There doesn't seem to be a great deal of urgency within those institutions, and I am increasingly worried about the way the UN postures and what it does, and it's almost like defending indirectly the oppressors. It's defending quite often in a subtle way. It's protecting those who are willing to commit genocide, and even those who are willing to frame other people for crimes they haven't committed. The OPCW, the chemical weapons on Syria, that was another classic case. They were very weak-willed on that. But they're doing it currently on the IAEA. The main push, the main backing for American and Israeli assaults on the sovereignty of the Islamic Republic of Iran, for instance, has been nuclear weapons. The allegation that they can possibly make nuclear weapons. Not that they've actually made them. The CIA have said that Iran is not close to even making them. They admitted it. But on the other hand, you've got other agencies then pushing the agenda to commit to regime change in whatever way, and now war. And that war is not, as you've hinted, is not a joke, because the Israelis, who are very much at the forefront of that war, wanting that war, and even engaged, of course, the 12-day lesson that I guess the Islamic Republic of Iran taught them was that actually Israel can also be wiped out by ballistic missiles. But Israel is sitting there quite smugly without anybody checking, for instance, on how many nuclear warheads they've even got. They don't even admit they've got them, and the IAEA is not even compelled to go and ask them how many they've got them. And the Americans don't admit that they've got them when everybody knows they've got them. And they even say, we've got the Samson option. They openly say that we've got a Samson option, which allows us to potentially use nuclear weapons on anybody we consider to be our enemy. That is quite frightening. And again, the agencies before all this evidence, just seem absolutely like eunuchs and absolutely, neutered.
Yeah, and it's incredible, isn't it? Because we've gone through, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and we've been bouncing between these, bringing democracy. These people they're harboring weapons of mass destruction, prohibited weapons. We've been bouncing back and forth between those propaganda narratives for 25 years. Every time in the past, it becomes clear within, almost straight away, but sometimes within a few years that, well, there weren't any weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and the intelligence was manipulated. And yet here we are again, and these same cards are being played in relation to Iran. And as you say, I think, I'm sort of go with Mearsheimer on this, Iran probably should get hold of the bomb as quickly as it possibly can, because there is nothing that you can see in the communications coming from Western governments and the US government, and Israel, of course, which suggests that there is ever going to be a backing down from the objective of regime change of the Iranian government. Wesley Clark, we had the 7 countries in 5 years. We know the planning documents prior to 9/11 were talking about Iran. It's clear that the powers that be in the West, who dominate the West and to a large extent dominate international politics, want to overthrow that government. You can see it in the words which come out of the mouth of Trump and all of the people behind him. So this isn't going to go away. So it's probably in their interest to get the bomb as quickly as possible. And I suspect at the moment, and because we're not on the ground or we don't have access to intelligence in these areas, I wonder how much China and Russia are coming to the aid of Iran and sending a signal to the United States. Because is this where we're going to have the final flashpoint between, the weakening imperial empire of the West and the emerging new power blocks in the international system? Is this the flashpoint where you have a war? And, we could be going down that road at the moment.
Thank you very much, Dr. Piers Robinson. I'm really glad we had a broader conversation at the end, but our context was chemical weapons and the fact that it's been proven that the OPCW as an institution failed in its job and actually ended up really being complicit with the Western deep state in trying to frame a particular government and created essentially regime change as part of that sort of operation, that psychological operation. If that can happen with the OPCW, and we know that the IAEA is also very much hand in glove with American and Israeli interests in terms of what they're doing with Iran, then what control do we really have left over international institutions? And how are we going to assert control from the people so that people are safe? How do we assert real security if the very institutions set up to protect us, to protect the world, are actually siding with imperialist interests? This is still a question that needs to be considered by all of us and to be investigated further. And to be blindly trusting international institutions now seems an absolute, travesty. Nobody can close their eyes. Nobody can go to sleep on this. We're in really, really dangerous territory at the moment. Thank you again, Dr. Piers, and please do like, share, and subscribe to the channel so that we can bring you the voices which are often suppressed. Well, not often, always suppressed by mainstream Western media, imperialist media, I have to call it now, really, because they don't want these facts coming out. And unless you back independent channels like us who are willing to go there, I'm afraid that you're going to have a one-sided propaganda exercise, which was also the main theme of this program. Propaganda is power, it seems. Take care.